It's Transfiguration Sunday. It's kind of a wild story, but very important. So let's jump into it. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John, led them up on a high mountain, apart by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. It really is an unbelievable text, and I use that word intentionally. I mean, science can't explain this. It reads like fantasy. I mean, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up on a mountain, transfigures into white, and then Moses and Elijah appear and start talking? Unbelievable. Now, I said it matters because I'll tell you why. This story reminds us that there's always more going on in this life than just what our eyes can see. Whether we realize it or not, the spiritual realm is active, alive. Jesus is showing off his power. He's revealing a deep secret, and we need to be in on it. And the secret is this, that Jesus can operate firmly and smoothly in both the spiritual and the earthly realms. And eventually we all will too. Remember in the Lord's Prayer where it says, "Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven"? What we're getting here is a glimpse into that future. Theologian N.T. Wright says, "Thy kingdom come is like two hands folding together. The earthly and the spiritual become one." You know, for all of Jesus' ministry, his biggest purpose was to bring us new life within a new kingdom. Jesus came to inaugurate the kingdom of God on earth as it is in heaven. I think it's really bizarre how often we miss this. But we're not the only ones. The disciples, they miss it too. Look at verse 5. Then Peter says to Jesus, "Rabbi, it's good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one of you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. That last verse gets me. He did not know what to say. He was terrified. But yet, and maybe this is surprising or maybe it's not, he said something anyway. Peter couldn't handle the depth of the moment, so he just started talking. What I wish Peter would have done was just be present, open his soul, lean in. But he couldn't. He was terrified. And so he just started speaking and doing things that were sweet, but misguided. There are times when the spiritual realm interacts with us, and we're not ready for it either. We don't know what to say, we're terrified, and we miss the depth of the moment. We need better examples of depth. We need better practices that help us contemplate and sit and prepare for the divine. And that's where church has to come into play for people. I think true communal spirituality, a real shared church experience, should be about training all of us to look into mystery as individuals and as a community, and then welcome it together. And for that work, not to be rank with ego or fear or unease. And to do this takes practice and discipline and a healthy sense of awe and wonder. And that's where I see people today struggling. We need a better capacity for awe and wonder. But like the disciples in Mark 9, we aren't trained. We're not comfortable with the unknown. So oftentimes, we miss it. But if we could be people who develop the ability to sit in the awesome wonder of God, to take in the spiritual and let it bump up against the earthly realms, and then not feel rushed to name it or explain it or dissect it, then we'd experience the greatest truths that God has to offer. We'd see mystery and then fall in love with it. I really think if we're going to be people who truly love our neighbors, then we have to build the capacity, the spiritual practice to experience awe and wonder of God, and then to love it. Now, these thoughts may not feel like they connect to you, that we need awe and wonder, and that's going to help us love our neighbor. But I promise they do. It's how Jesus was able to travel between the spiritual and the earthly realms so easily, and it's how we can too. We have to develop the ability to sit in the unknown and believe that that which emerges is both from God and good for us. To have this discipline, it frees us to love one another because it eliminates the fear that what the other might bring to us is for our detriment or our harm. And not having the capacity means we're closed off to the spiritual, and then we only experience the earthly. And when this is the case, we start getting rigid about what it is that we have and what defines us and our way of worship and our kind of doctrine and our understanding of sacraments and our ecclesial theology. We become prideful and protective over the stuff when we're only stuck in the earthly. We care about our buildings, our plans, our ministries, our finances. This is what matters most because we're building a legacy in the earthly realm. And that's not bad. But if this is all there is, then we score a 50 on the test of life and we fail. We have to also live in the spiritual. And when we can live and operate in both, our soul opens to loving our neighbor more because we're less focused on what is ours. Now do you see the connection? We must be people who live in a way in which our lives are informed by our experiences in both the spiritual and the earthly realms. And that's the problem with what Peter does here. He rushes too quickly to name what's happening. He tries to build an altar. He starts operating in the earthly realm with earthly expectations despite being firmly in the spiritual one. And that's not terrible. It's just misguided. And honestly, I picture Jesus taking a big, deep sigh here, knowing this moment could have been more. Peter just misses the larger point. He doesn't show the capacity to sit in awe and wonder, which means he carries more fear than he should. Scripture does say that he's terrified. And he's talking about Peter and James and John too, because they don't know how to embrace the spiritual realm. So Jesus just sighs. And so if you don't believe your proclivity to the spiritual realm impacts your earthly one, just watch what happens to the disciples as we keep reading in Mark 9. These are the scenes that follow after they come off the mountain of transfiguration. When they come down the mountain, they come to a scene with the other disciples arguing with scribes about what to do with a spirit-possessed boy. Jesus steps in and immediately heals the boy, but the disciples can't understand how this happened. They're dumbfounded, and Jesus just sighs. This moment could have been so much more. And then Jesus foretells his death. But the disciples again don't understand what he's saying, and they just start saying a bunch of words about Elijah and death and what is to come. And again, they miss the point, and Jesus just sighs. This moment, too, could have been so much more. Well, then, as the disciples walk on, they start arguing with one another about who is the greatest in God's new kingdom. And they start gifting themselves titles. And yet again, Jesus just sighs. This moment too, it could have been so much more. Then the disciples stumble upon some of Jesus' followers serving, and they're helping the sick and the ill. And the disciples shut it down immediately. And then they proudly proclaim, "They were trying to act like you, Jesus, so we stopped them." At this moment, you can see Jesus' eyes get huge. And he says, you can almost hear the sigh that he would say to them as he says, my goodness, guys, if they're not against us, they're with us. They're for us. I mean, this too could have been such a better moment. It's scene after scene after scene. The disciples miss the deeper meaning of what's unfolding. They are in the presence of the divine. They're witnessing the spiritual, but they miss it because they haven't yet developed the inner depth to see the spiritual, to be in the presence of mystery. And this affects how they love their neighbor and their capacity they have for their neighbor. And this is still true today. Loving our neighbor requires a healthy awareness of the spiritual realm. And this is what I want you to see today. Even though Jesus is obviously frustrated with his disciples throughout the whole chapter, he loves them anyway. He engages them anyway. He lives with them and does ministry with them anyway. When you develop a deeper, more contemplative spirituality like we see in Jesus, you're able to make room for people who are sweet but misguided. When you live out of the spiritual realm, then you won't feel competition with others. You won't let their anxiety stick to you either. So do you see the connection now? If we're rooted deeply on the inside, we'll have the capacity to love our neighbors on the outside because we won't feel threatened or in competition with them. We can hold them for who they are and how they are, knowing we belong to something else and we're tethered to something more, deeper, truer, and everlasting. Now there's a million examples I can give of this, but I'll leave you with just one. And it deals with politics, albeit indirectly. Clearly, politics has been a point of contention for all of us. Families have stopped talking, stopped associating. Social media friends have severed ties, blocked users. We now have camps that cannot engage or discuss anything with other camps. I believe it's as bad as I have ever seen it in my life. And honestly, we are all affected by this. It's conflicting. There's people we love, neighbors we adore, friends, church members, people we thought we knew, but my goodness, I can't believe they see the world the way they do. And they can't believe I see the world the way I do. And then what we say to each other, or at least what we think is, can you believe they support that political ideology or that movement or that candidate? I don't think I can speak to them again. And this is where we are. And it is an ever-sucking trap that draws us all in. The last several years have been terrible. It's unmasked for us that we do not freely live or operate out of the spiritual realm at all. If we did, we wouldn't act like we're acting. We are earthly creatures fighting for an earthly reward. And it revolves around power and control and ego. And both sides of the political divide want the power and the privilege and the ego because they believe that their side will lead to greater good. So what has been the outcome of all of this tension? Hate, hurt, death, riots, insurrection, terribly foul language about the other, lies, and then more lies, and a decaying trust in the inherent goodness of people and government due to mass amounts of lies. And as long as we live out of the earthly realm only, this will continue to be our reward. We'll get more hurt, more hate, more dividing lines, more lies. Do you know how you can tell if you're living out of the earthly realm only? Lies. But there is a way forward. Without conceding your convictions or rolling over or taking on the other's anxieties, there is a way you can stay differentiated and still love your neighbor who are confused and misguided. It happens when you develop a strong inner spiritual core and you live out of your soul. This is the way we can hold that which we hate or don't understand, because we hold it in the light of love. The earthly realm can't do this, but God can, and Spirit can. And we're called to be people who live and move and have our being in Spirit. You learn to do this, then you'll learn to love your neighbor as you love yourself.